I think we should get going then. Good afternoon to you and good afternoon to the people online. For those of you who weren't around at the beginning, my name's Steve Smallwood. I work at the Office for National Statistics, or at least that's what I tell people. Rich might tell you differently. But I'm also Vice President of BSPS, becoming President in September, and it's a real privilege to be able to chair this afternoon session. Just a little bit on how we're going to work this afternoon. We're going to have quite a lot of presentations, so sorry that you're going to be talked at immediately after lunch. Please try not to fall asleep. I can see you yawning, Andrew. But what we're going to do is go through those presentations. I will just give a few moments for questions for clarification at the end of each presentation, because I think it's important if there's something immediate for clarification. But then we have a good length of time to actually have a real discussion, which can consider both the presentations in the afternoon and maybe something from this morning that has come to you, or something that you just don't think has been said yet in this day. So that's how we're going to work. You really don't want to hear any more of my voice, and I want to introduce you to Ollie Duke-Williams, who you've already met this morning. I've known Ollie for many years. Indeed, I think the first thing we possibly worked on was triangulation in the relationship matrix, which was something that John Haskey had started off, and then I think between us we managed to crack some of that, Ollie with the brain work mainly. But Ollie has been involved in many things that you've heard about this morning, so I'm not going to say any more. The one thing I do want to say before he starts is this was meant to be a joint presentation with Jane Falkingham. Jane has unfortunately had a family crisis and was unable to join us today. She does send her regards and is really disappointed not to be here. But I'm very appreciative of the fact that Ollie has probably got so many things to say. He's probably quite pleased of the expanded time that he has. Over to you, Ollie.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. As you said, this was going to be a joint presentation with Jane Falkingham. I was going to focus on census data, and obviously demographic data is a lot broader than just census data. So I've sort of adapted what I'm going to say a little bit to sort of argue that I'm talking about census data as an example of wider demographic data. So the things I'm saying don't just hold for census, they hold for other sorts of data as well. So the phrase users of UK demographic statistics can be interpreted in a number of ways. Demographic data is a very rich variety of different sorts of data. It's not just census. In terms of providing data for users and supporting users, which is how I'm coming to this. I'm coming to this from my role in the UK Data Service. We don't really just mean data. We mean data, we mean metadata, we mean documentation, we mean training, we mean lots of things. Our users and our potential users are not just UK-based. Such as the licenses allow us to do, we really want to work with people who are interested in the UK and their data, but are based outside the UK. We're also interested in users and potential users who aren't just within the usual user groups. And by that, I'm thinking of academics, of national and local government, and related groups who we're used to interacting with, who we're used to discussing data with. We're also interested in UKDS working with other groups, sort of small special interest groups, that sort of thing, who use this data but perhaps don't get represented as well as and don't get remembered as well as some of the other people. And I also want to stress, as this is sort of linking to what Jane would have said, the UK Data Service is not the only story here. There are other routes to demographic data, many of them ESRC funded, but not all of them. So what I'm saying is from the point of view of UKDS, but it should be understood more broadly as well. A very brief introduction to what we do for those who are unfamiliar. The UK Data Service is an ESRC-funded entity. We provide an infrastructure for curating and providing access to social science data. We're a conglomerate of several institutions, universities of Essex, of Manchester, of Edinburgh, in UCL here, and also JISC. UKDS manages access to data and, as I said before, training, documentation, metadata, standards, and so on, in a number of different repositories. Chief amongst those are the UK Data Archive. So the archive is a repository, and the service facilitates access to data in that archive. But we have a number of other sort of sources as well. So, for example, we've got the Secure Data Service, which provides secure access to some data sets. Census Programme, we used to be funded Census Programme as a sort of separate entity to the data service, and prior to that, the data archive. The census groups are now, apart from the longitudinal studies, within the service, but our setup is slightly different, and we use different systems and different interfaces. There are other repositories as well. For example, the Reshared repository, which allows researchers to be compliant with their conditions of funding, to upload the data that they've created and have that stored. This is a licensing framework that applies to UKDS and to other sort of similar organisations as well. So we've got data held at a number of different types of sort of subject to a number of different types of access. Open data is obviously the easiest for us to use. Then we have safeguarded data, which has some restrictions on its usage. And then we have controlled access data as well. In the case of UKDS, that controlled access data can be used through the Secure Lab setup. ONS, for example, also provide the SRS and IDS, which provide access to secure data as well for different groups of people. So what do users want? Well, this is probably the most obvious point I'll ever make. Users want access to be as simple as possible. Of course they do. So we as developers try and make that access look simple. So for certain groups, in the data that I work with, origin destination data, for certain groups, you can have access both to open data and to safeguarded data. And the systems that we develop, we spend a lot of time working on the stuff under the hood to make that look really simple. In fact, that's a lot of what the interface has to do, to work out whether people have the right permissions to use different sorts of data. If we were only dealing with open data, then things would be potentially rather easier. Most of the users probably, well, I've said many, probably most of the users that we talk to recognise the need that we have to control access to some data, data that is most disclosive. That doesn't mean they're particularly happy about that. They quite rightly complain about delays and barriers to access, but they do recognise that there's a need for those barriers to access. And I would reflect that the ability to access secure data remotely has improved over time. So as a result of, or in response to the pandemic, ONS did a lot of work in making it easier for people to, accredited researchers, to use data remotely in ways that hadn't been permitted before. And I think it's fair to say that we as providers of data appreciate that, but I think also a lot of users appreciate that things have improved. Moving on to the census data, which is sort of my focus of interest within UKDS. We provide access to a variety of different sorts of output, and how we sort of conceptualize that is that data can be divided in a number of ways. We can think of types of data, we can think of sources of data, we can think of different years that census data is collected for, and we can think in terms of different sorts of data licenses. And all of these have a bearing on how we provide data. The next slide is on types of data. This will be, I think, obvious to most of you, but so from our survey responses and from people I know who are online, not everyone is familiar with everything that happens with the census. So for those of you who are experts, forgive me, one type of data that comes out of the census isn't to do with people at all, directly or not directly to do with them. It's boundaries that are constructed for areas as a result of the census data that's been collected. People live within those areas, and from them we count all the people in each area and we get aggregate data. And this is the form of census data that most people are familiar with. This is a form of data that students in geography and other social science disciplines learn about. And these are just the data about how many people living in this area have a particular set of characteristics. We also have flow data. So those are data about movement of people from one place to another, or movement of people within a place. And that is migration, and that is commuting. That's the area that I'm particularly involved with. We also have microdata. So microdata are anonymized records for for a set of individuals, usually a sample of individuals, that tell us something about those people. And different sorts of research will prioritize different sorts of data, will be suitable for different sorts of data. We can think about types of access. The different data types require different sorts of data. So we construct different interfaces to provide access for those. In the case of microdata, so sets of individual de-identified records, those are most similar to the other sorts of data that UKDS tends to provide access for. And they're generally managed in the same way as most UKDS datasets are, in that people can find them in a catalogue, download them, and then use them with their own analysis software. The other types of data have bespoke interfaces, and this reflects the fact that they're different sorts of data. We're developing newer systems over time that have a sort of more formal API structure, so can be accessed by a computer program. And then we can build front-end interfaces that use that API to deliver the data to users, but at the same time allowing other services to potentially be developed as well, which will use the same interface calls to provide access to the data using different interfaces. There are other routes to the data as well. So the statistical agencies provide their own interface systems and own access routes to the data. So, and other organisations such as NOMIS do as well. And in some cases, for a given set of data, there'll be more than one way of getting it. In other cases, there's a much more limited, for the more specialist data, there tends to be a much more limited set of routes to the data. So we've got here an example with UKDS. You can look something up in the catalogue, and then you'll get sent to one of a number of different types of interfaces that allow you to work with that data or download it. Users, we've seen that there are lots of different types of interfaces. Users generally don't want that. Users don't want to have to learn new interfaces, and we accept that, but would note that sometimes this is forced upon us. These are different sorts of data with different sort of specifics, and that tends to end up meaning that you need different interfaces to get to the different sorts of data. We've got newer projects going on. So within the aggregate data world in UKDS, we've developed a data explorer or added census data to a data explorer that will allow you to subset data rather than downloading it as a big monolithic file. We're developing a new API for flow data and a new front end for using that flow data. And my colleague, Vasilis Skroutsits, is working on a project called Cordial AI, which is using the same Flow Data API in an entirely different way, is using it for natural language queries of the sort we see with things like ChatGPT, to allow people to query the Flow Data using that sort of approach. That's under development at the moment, but you can type in a question saying, how many people drove to go to work from Leeds to Manchester? And it will, from that, turn that into a query against the database and give the user the results. And we're looking at how successfully it does that. So user requirements for access are really diverse. There are different data types which promote different sorts of access. People have differing levels of knowledge. They want different volumes of data. Some people want one number for one place. Some people want a set of numbers for every place in the country. There are differing levels of user technical expertise. So if we think of the sort of data that users want, some of them want a sort of plain CSV file, and that's as complex as they want. Other people want sort of advanced JSON and XML-based formats. And both of those are entirely valid requirements, I think. And we need to support users at different levels of expertise and different levels of requirement, which makes the job more complicated for us, but hopefully makes things easier for the users. An example here of sort of advances, non-UKDS advances in data delivery. These are the flexible table builders that were used with 2021 data. On the left from ONS, on the right from NISRA. And this is really welcome. Within the sort of census program, the academic community, we've been asking ONS and the other agencies to develop these sorts of tools for a very long time. And so it was really great to see that they were able to do that with 2021. In both of these cases, I've specified similar tables, main language by age. They're broadly similar schemes. The differences I'd point out, which are kind of deliberate, on the left with ONS, I'm using a local authority level geography, and it's telling me that it can produce the data for 176 out of 331 areas. And I can decide what I want to do at that point. Do I make the geography more coarse? Do I make my attribute detail more coarse? On the right with NISRA, it's defaulted to producing this for the whole of Northern Ireland. So it's telling me I can do that. One of the other interesting things here is that the Northern Ireland interface has this option here, pivot table. And that's useful for different user requirements. And that's what I'm showing here. This is two versions of the output for Northern Ireland. We've got one observation per line. The other one, we've got a cross-tabulation. And different users prefer different sorts of things. The one on the left, if you want to use R or Stata or something like that, that's what you want your data to look like. If you want to just eyeball the data and get an idea of what the patterns are, and especially if you're a novice user, users tend to prefer this sort of thing. And I think we need to be able to support both. In terms of sources, as we've said, we have not just one census agency in the UK, but 3. We've talked about devolution. Users, in terms of data, aren't interested in devolution. They just want to get data for the UK. If that's their focus area, they don't want to have to go to different websites to get their data. They just want it for the UK, and they want it to be harmonised. And we try and do that in UKDS. We try and join those outputs together. As we've heard, ONS have just released some UK-level outputs as well. That's not an easy task, but users assume that it should be. I also note here, some of the people that use census data aren't interested in the census. They're only interested in census data to create a rate for something they're interested in. What they're interested in is whatever their numerator is, disease incidence or something like that. They use census data, but they don't really care about it. They just want a population count. And we need to make that easy as well. Different sorts of licenses. What we see here, aggregate data is all open. Flow data, there's a variety of licenses. Some of it's in secure settings, some of it isn't. Microdata, we've got a variety of licenses. The longitudinal data are all solely limited to secure access. In his history of demographic data, Steve talked about the history of the census. So I can think we can typify, we can sort of classify data in a number of ways. So here I've listed the censuses with individual records. I've omitted 1966 and I've omitted the censuses in Northern Ireland that were at different years, just to simplify the picture a bit. And this is one way of thinking about it. This is my interpretation. So this isn't any sort of official classification. I classify as historic census data those data that have been released under the 100-year rule. Latest is a fairly obvious classification. It was the last census. Then in the middle, we've got recent, which goes back to 1961. And that's data that we can deliver through UKDS in a broadly similar manner to the latest data. Not all of our data is like that, but we have microdata for 1961 that we deliver in exactly the same way as microdata for more recent censuses. Then anything in between I've called old. So there are recovery projects going on to try and make those machine readable through scanning printed volumes and then extracting the data from them. And that's an ongoing project. So some of this old will move to recent when that happens. And the classification will become increasingly badly named. But this is one way of thinking about it. Users don't want, again, like the different countries, users don't want to have to go to different websites. They want to get all their data from the same place. As with harmonization between countries, people want to compare data between years and want that to be harmonized and want the questions to be the same so that they can do an easy comparison. This is my speculative graph of level of interest in different sorts of data. So I reckon historians are interested in older data. Sort of contemporary analysts are interested in newer data. This sort of old 31, 51, 61 sort of area, I admit people are probably less interested than that, in that than I as a data nerd are. But I realise I'm kind of on my own with people like you, down in this limited set of interest here. But I still think we should provide that data. We've got to justify the resource spend on making that data available, but I think we ought to be doing it. We can extend that classification. Beyond latest, we get next. And that's the thing that all of us here are interested in. So my sort of final slide here. We have a recommendation of a census in 2031. What does that mean for users? Some users have a keen interest in question development, and we'd strongly encourage them to get involved with the consultation that's already live in Scotland and will occur elsewhere. We want to recognise I want those consultations to be constructed recognising that users have different needs. It should be as diverse as possible. Solutions at different technical levels are needed. As I said, some people want CSV data, some people want complex XML-based feeds, and both of those are valid requests. We should consider access needs. By my calculation, I've got about a minute left. We should make all of the data accessible in an easy way. Making data being able to repeat your research. One of the concerns about admin data is that admin data come from a stream. Can you get that data back exactly in the same way that you had 6 months ago? It might be subject to corrections. You know, we really want replicable research, and admin data might play with that a bit and make that a bit harder. Finally, historic data. the left-hand side of my speculative interest graph. The 2021 census was really interesting. It was predominantly collected online. This breaks down the argument in 100 years' time that the sort of commercial genealogy companies are going to do the transcription job and then try and recoup their money through charging for access to it. The data already exist in digital form and should be made available. But it's also interesting to think about what people want. People like looking at the image of a census return for their grandparents or great-grandparents or people living in their house 100 years ago. They probably don't have the same emotional engagement with just a set of typed-in data, and that's quite interesting. How we develop demographic data in the future also brings into question that thing. We've talked a lot today about both census and admin. Admin adding richness to the census. There's a big difference, I think, between looking at that digitized image of a census form and looking at a tax record for how much your forebear what your forebear's income was, just like as a single line in a spreadsheet, that sort of thing. Admin data aren't as emotionally engaging as a traditional census, I'd say. But we can also say, is the traditional census in the 2021 delivered online sense that emotionally engaging? Ireland did a really interesting thing that people could write a message on their form to the future, but less than 20% of households actually did that. So it's interesting, but it wasn't that interesting to people. And that's me done.